very much for joining us today. I'm Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Laurentian University, and a Canada Research Chair in Environment, Culture, and Values. I'm also the Director of the Center for Humanities, Research and Creativity, and a founding member of the Center for Evolutionary, Ecology, and Ethical Conservation. The Director of that center is Hofstede, wave to the crowd. He is also a Canada Research Chair in Applied Evolutionary Ecology. Now, CEEEC, which is what we call the Center for short, is an interdisciplinary research group of philosophers and ecologists, and it's organizing this series of evolution-themed events, which we're referring to as Evolution in Action. Now, tonight's talk is the keynote presentation for this week, and it's being co-organized with Research Week at Laurentian University's Office of Research and Creativity. Now, it's a great pleasure today to introduce our keynote speaker, the world-renowned Darwinian and evolutionary scholar, Dr. Michael Ruse. He is the Lucycle T. Werkmeister Professor of Philosophy and Director of the Program for the History and Philosophy of Science at Florida State University. Previously, he was a professor of philosophy at the University of Guelph for 35 years and also founded that program. And on a side note, and a personal reflection, many people in this room have actually taken classes on the philosophy of biology with Dr. Ruse, including Albrecht, including myself, including Dr. Barney, Dr. Lipskis, and many others. And it's been amazing how, during the organization and promotion of this event, how many people have come out of the woodwork to say that they actually have been influenced by him, not just through his research, but also pedagogically. He is the author of over 50 books. He is a founder of the field of the philosophy of biology. He's a world expert on Darwinism and its implications for science, philosophy, and religion. His awards and acclamations are far too many to list in full, but just to name a few, he's a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada, a Gifford Lecturer, a Guggenheim and Killam Fellow, and a recipient of 4 honorary degrees. He's here today to speak of the true impact of Darwin's publication on the origin of species, on Victorian science and society, and about how we can learn about the myths and anachronisms that have arisen in response to that with respect to the Darwinian revolution. We are extremely fortunate, grateful, and excited to welcome to the podium Professor Michael Ruse.
Thanks, Gillian. Well, I guess there aren't many people from Florida who fly up to Sudbury and say it gives me great pleasure to be here. But it does, in fact, give me a lot of pleasure to be here because I've got 2 of my students. Where's Alan? Where's my other student? Is he hiding away somewhere? He disappeared. There he is, there. So I've got 2 of my students in the room, and it's just a wonderful feeling to be able to pass things on from one generation to the next. In fact, I did a little radio thing this afternoon, and when I got back to my room, there was an email from somebody who's already retired teacher who said that he'd taken one of my courses and enjoyed it very much years ago. It's kind of frightening when you meet people and you think, oh my God, you know, they must be 10 years older than you, and they say, Professor Ruse, I was in your class back in, oh my God, that makes me wonder how old I am. I'm going to talk tonight about the Darwinian revolution. I'm going to talk, it's a general talk. I find it very interesting, and I hope that you'll, by the end of the evening, share some of my interest about this. I've got some ideas. I've been rethinking it a little bit. I was in South Africa last fall and did a lot of reading, and I'm trying to get a slightly different perspective on it from the way that I've been thinking about it for 30 or 40 years. So, my question is, was there a Darwinian revolution? The answer is, of course, yes there was, but the question is, what kind of Darwinian revolution was there? Okay, I like to divide the history of evolutionary theory into 3 parts. I should say that evolution is a child, basically, of the Enlightenment. Up to around 1700, there weren't really any evolutionists. And if you go back to the Greeks, although there were people who had all sorts of ideas about natural origins, nobody really had much of an idea about evolution. It wasn't that they were against it particularly, it was just not one of their ideas. The great philosophers like Plato and Aristotle, for instance, tended to be much more impressed by mathematics and think of the world as kind of eternal, like 2 + 2 = 4. It never began, it never ends, it just keeps going on. Of course, the Jewish story of origins, does have a definite history. And although nobody, at least back then, was a strict literalist, nobody was a strict literalist, it's clear that right through the time of the scientific revolution and through the 17th century, by and large, the Genesis story was the background that everybody accepted. And then around the beginnings of the 18th century, a new philosophy, let's call it that, came on the scene. And this was the idea of progress, that we humans can do things ourselves with our own unaided hands. And very much this was opposed to the idea of providence, namely that we have to leave everything to God to do it. So it's interesting, even at this point, people are not fighting over the literal truth of the Bible so much, but more, if you like, a philosophical theological opposition. On the one hand, there were people like Diderot, Condorcet in England, William Godwin, who thought that we can improve through science and education and that sort of thing. We can do it ourselves. And then on the other hand, there were those people, particularly the Methodists, particularly people like John and Charles Wesley and others, who thought, no, we can only, as it were, succeed through the blood of the Lamb. It's through Jesus' sacrifice on the cross that we can move forward. The great hymn by Isaac Watts, written, a Congregationalist minister, written about 1710. When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died, my greatest claim I count but loss, and pour contempt on all my pride. In other words, folks, you've got to come to Jesus, because if you don't, you're just not going to get anywhere. So you get this kind of opposition in the 18th century. Now, the interesting thing is that evolution, and I say evolution is a pseudoscience, evolution gets involved in this debate very quickly. It's not so much a question of evolution versus Genesis taken literally, but rather evolution was seen to be part and parcel of the picture of progress. That in the social world, you start with ignorance and all of these things, and you work up and up and up till you get development and civilization. And similarly, in the biological world, you start with blobs, and you work your way up and up and up until you finally get to humans, and then if you put a bit more effort in, finally at the top you get to Englishmen. But that's that's not funny, that's not funny. Anyway, one of the early evolutionists was this man, Erasmus Darwin. He's the grandfather of Charles Darwin. He was an English physician at the end of the 18th century. He was a very good physician. He was also a good friend of industrialists, people like James Watt and others like that, and Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, and people like that. And he was also a poet, and he was an early evolutionist. And he wrote poetry, as it were, lauding or hymning the idea of evolution. Imperious man who rules the bestial crowd, of language, reason, and reflection proud, with brow erect who scorns this earthly sod, and styles himself the image of his God, arose from rudiments of form and sense, an embryon point, or microscopic ends. So you see, you start at the point, and you work your way up to humans up at the top. And so this was the kind of picture. Now, this is why I call it a pseudoscience, in the sense that nobody had much evidence. They didn't have a lot of fossil evidence. They didn't know much. I mean, they were now starting to turn up orangutans and chimpanzees and that sort of thing, but nobody had much in the way of solid evidence. I mean, there was no debate about, I believe in evolution because of the fossil record or something like that. I mean, they were starting to turn up fossils, but it was all very much of an epiphenomenon of a belief in progress. And evolution and this kind of philosophy went hand in hand. So that's what I mean by calling it a pseudoscience. It doesn't mean, I mean, I think a lot of people took up the idea, because something's a pseudoscience, it doesn't mean it's not popular. But what I mean is it wasn't real science, if you know what I mean. Okay, next please. Now, as we go through the 19th century, evolution still doesn't become a hard science, but already people are working on and around things which are going to add up and make for evolution. This is Charles Lyell, the Scottish geologist, a very important figure in the history, in the life of Charles Darwin. And Lyell, in 1830, started to publish his great work, The Principles of Geology, being an attempt to explain the former changes of the Earth's surface by reference to causes now in operation. It says it's going to be 2 volumes. In fact, it's stretched to 3. And you can see this is from a temple in just outside Naples, I think. And what Lyell's trying to give you is the idea that you don't need miracles, you don't need super duper floods or anything like that. Give enough time and rain and silt and all of these things can make mountains, or gets carried down to the sea and makes islands and all of these sorts of things. The main thing, though, of course, what Lyell's doing is pushing back in time. And you should understand that although people wouldn't always have gone the full length that Lyell went, even the religious people had no trouble with this. People were increasingly finding in the first part of the 19th century, yes, that it's clear that the Earth is a lot older than, say, 6,000 years, which was the date calculated by Archbishop Usher in the 17th century. So already people are pushing back the age of the Earth. They're not evolutionists yet. And then in 1844, this man, Robert Chambers, he was a publisher, Scot, a lot of Scots in the story. He was a publisher, and he published anonymously a very, the sort of Richard Dawkins sort of book of the age or something like that. It was an instant bestseller. Of course, nobody knew who it was. And this was Vestiges of the Natural History of Creation, where he argued for evolution. By this time, they were starting to dig up the fossils. And they were starting to get an idea, yes, that the fossil record is roughly progressive. Nobody had any idea of the early fossils. The earliest fossils that they got, by working out, when I say the earliest, they had no absolute dates, but these were the lowest in the strata, would be things like trilobites, the crab-like organisms. They're now extinct, but are the sort of equivalent of crabs and that sort of thing. And these are really, really quite complex. I'm very proud of the fact I have 5 children, and their old man was the first to get a tattoo. Boy, were they pissed off. Not as much as my wife was when she came back and found I'd done it. Anyway, so by this time they were getting an idea of some sort of fossil record being roughly progressive. And Chambers, who was also very keen on progress because he was a businessman and could see how he was into printing with machines and this sort of thing. And it was all a package. Now, what's interesting is that the scientists, a part of my story is this very interesting thing, is that the scientists didn't like it. The scientists said, this is BS, this is total nonsense. But the general public loved it. The general public picked it up and ran with it, as it were. And one of the people who ran with it farthest and hardest was none other than the man. He was not yet Alfred Lord Tennyson, he was not yet Poet Laureate, but he was shortly to become Poet Laureate. But he was very much, in Victorian Britain, the people's poet. And as I'm sure you all know, he wrote this very famous poem, In Memoriam, which is published in 1851. Now, In Memoriam is it's a long poem, and it dates back to 1833. And Tennyson was very close friends with a man called Arthur Hallam. They were both in their early 20s at this point. And Hallam died suddenly, and Tennyson was devastated. I don't think it was, you know, I don't think it was homoerotic or anything like that. It was the kind of close friendships that one formed in those days, particularly in the time of single-sex education, and you'd all go off, the men would go off to university, and so they would make lifelong friends in that sort of way. And so Tennyson and Hallam were very close friends. Hallam died, and Tennyson was devastated and started, he was already a poet by this stage, started to write a poem. And it took him 20 years to write it. And Tennyson was always very sensitive to science. He was very interested in science. In fact, I think towards the end of his life, the scientists actually made him a Fellow of the Royal Society, noting that, I mean, he wasn't just interested in science, he was serious about it. I mean, he wasn't a scientist, but he was serious about science and understanding science. And he picked up on Lyell's Geology. And he found it very depressing, because Lyell's geology is time. Things just keep going on and on and on and on and on. Rain, sleet, earthquakes, volcanoes, and basically, there ain't no point to it. And so this is the middle part of Tennyson's poem. Our God and nature then at strife, that nature lends such evil dreams, so careful of the type she seems, so careless of the single life. So what he's saying is, you know, individuals just seem to get wiped out, but at least the species keeps going. And then he says, so careful of the type, but no, from scarped cliff and quarried stone she cries, 1,000 types are gone, I care for nothing, all shall go. And of course, by this time, people are starting to dig up, for instance, they've discovered the first dinosaurs. And they realize there are no dinosaurs today. So in other words, organisms get created and then just go. And what's even worse, they seem to get created before humans turn up. So already people are having to wrestle with these sorts of scientific come theological issues. And Tennyson picks up on this. And then he reads Chambers. And Chambers has this progressive view of life, going from the blob up to the human, monad to man, as they call it. And this is the end part of the poem. A soul shall strike from out the vast, and strike his being into balance, and move through life a lower phase, result in man, be born and think, and act and love, a closer link betwixt us and the crowning race. In Vestiges, what Chambers does is he speculates that maybe we're not the lost ones. There's going to be sort of superhumans above us, what he calls the crowning race. And now, what Tennyson does, very cleverly, is he suggests that maybe Hallam was a representative of that crowning race, but couldn't make it because he came too early. So, whereof the man that with me trod, this planet was a noble type, appearing ere the times were ripe, that friend of mine who lives in God. Very clever, very clever. But you see how they're mixing up science, evolution, religion. It's a fascinating mix. And one of the things I want to point to, and I think sort of, it's taken me all this time to sort of realize, the extent to which, even if the scientists are going around saying evolution bad, the general public aren't necessarily doing this. And who are speaking for the general public? Well, so often, as it always is, it's the novelists and the poets. These are the people who are putting ideas, working out ideas. I mean, today, it would be in television or film. But of course, my students don't realize this, but there was a time before television and film. And so people were very literate in those days, so people were reading an awful lot of poetry and an awful lot of novels and these sort of things. So that's where the ideas are getting worked out. That's where people are trying out ideas. I mean, today we look at Breaking Bad or Downton Abbey or whatever it might be, and you think about relationships and those sorts of things. And these help us to work on the the place of women, for instance. I mean, if you watch something like Downton Abbey and see how, what is the place of women in a society like that? Are they just, you know, just tools, or are they, in fact, significantly stronger? And should this give us more understanding of how relationships work? And what I'm saying is, back then, it was poetry and novels and those sorts of things. Now, phase 2. 1859, Charles Darwin appears on the scene, publishes his On the Origin of Species. One thing I should stress is that Darwin, by the time he published, was a well-known figure in Victorian Britain. We would have known who Charles Darwin was. Why? Because apart from anything else, he went on the voyage of the Beagle, and in 1845, well, 1839, but a popular edition came out in 1845, the Voyage of the Beagle. And every literate person would have read that. The Victorians loved travel stories. Think of, you know, David Livingstone and Stanley, you know, Dr. Livingstone, I presume. I mean, geography was a big thing back then. So people would have known him. They also knew that he was a good scientist. He'd written on these sorts of things. He was a figure who was known in Victorian Britain. And I think this is very important because, as it were, when Darwin published, even if you disagreed with him, you had to be very careful about being rude about him. In fact, you couldn't be. To be rude about Darwin would have been a social faux pas of the worst kind. Even if you disagreed with Darwin, people recognized that he was a good family man. And this is another thing. These Darwinians are very straight-laced, but they're straight-laced for a purpose. They know they're pushing ideas, they know they're pushing evolution. Huxley becomes an agnostic. So they've got to be so careful. They can't be seen going out every night and, you know, down to the pub or, you know, off to have a couple of prostitutes. There were many opportunities. Or if they did, they kept it very quiet. So they had to be very, very respectable. I mean, interestingly, for instance, Thomas Henry Huxley knew George Eliot, the novelist, very well. George Eliot lived with a man to whom she was not married. Huxley had no trouble going and visiting George Eliot, but he would never take his wife. He would not. Interestingly, the Darwins, on the other hand, had no trouble. Emma Darwin didn't mind meeting George Eliot. Interesting. Why? The Darwins were significantly higher social status than the Huxleys. And so the Darwins could get away with it because they were, as it were, they weren't aristocrats, but they were right up at the top. And so they could kind of get away with it. That a person lower down the social scale might be rather tense about doing or something like that. We all know the sort of thing I'm talking about. So Darwin publishes The Origin in 1859. He doesn't talk about humans, but everybody knew that humans was the story. And Huxley publishes Man's Place in Nature in 1863. And then Darwin finally publishes The Descent of Man in 1871. The Descent of Man is a very interesting book. It ought to be about humans. At least 3/4 of the book is in fact about sexual selection. This is Darwin's secondary mechanism, that males compete for females, females choose the males they want. So you've got the stags getting big antlers, and the peacock gets a big tail because the females choose. And Darwin applied all of this to humans. Why do you do this? Because the co-discoverer of natural selection, Alfred Russel Wallace, had in fact been a non-believer, and then in the 1860s took up spiritualism and started to argue that the only way that humans could have evolved is through spirit forces. And Darwin didn't want any part of that. But he knew that Wallace was pointing to some important things. Why human hairlessness? It doesn't seem to be very useful. Why do we have big brains? I mean, Wallace had lived with natives, or savages as they called them in those days, and he knew that they could be just as intelligent as the rest of us, but by and large he felt that they weren't using their brain power. So why had they got it? And Darwin said it all comes through sexual selection. So this is why sexual selection is a big thing in The Descent. So this is Charles Darwin, 1809 to 1882. I won't put this test to you, but if I'm giving this talk in America, I would say February the 12th, 1809. Who else was born on that date? And students look at you blankly. It has to be somebody of my age who says Abraham Lincoln. He died, he was sick a lot of his life, but he still lived to over 70 and died in 1882. Interesting portrait this. This is by George Richmond. It's painted in 1839. It's a wedding portrait. He's about to marry his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. And a portrait was painted by a man called George Richmond. You can't, the colours aren't very good here, but in fact it's a very good portrait. And the reason why it's a very good portrait is that George Richmond was the best portrait painter in the country at the time. And that tells you something. Here's a young man of 30 who doesn't have paid employment, can afford to have the best portrait painter in the country paint his portrait. The reason is the Darwins and Emma Wedgwood, the Wedgwoods, were very, very rich, particularly from the Wedgwood pottery. I mean, Darwin's grandfather on his mother's side, and Emma's grandfather, his wife's grandfather on her father's side, was Josiah Wedgwood. So these people were Silicon Valley rich. I mean, these people weren't just rich. These people were really very, very rich. And I think that this, again, all is part of Darwin's persona. For instance, one of the, he doesn't have to lecture. He doesn't have to have a job. So he doesn't have one. He gives it over to others to do the work, as it were, of proselytizing for him, and particularly his lieutenant, if you like, Thomas Henry Huxley. Darwin became an evolutionist in 1837. This is the first picture that we've got of him drawing a tree of life. As I'm sure you know, he went on the voyage of the Beagle from 1831 to 1836, but he never became an evolutionist on the Beagle. It was when he got back and was classifying his birds, particularly, that he turned to evolution. He discovered natural selection the year later, and then in 1859, he published The Origin of Species, some 20 years later. As I say, it was controversial work. It was certainly controversial work, but you've got to recognize that there was a very considerable dignity about the whole thing. I mean, people recognized that this was an important work, an important scientific work, and Darwin got kudos for doing this sort of thing. But as I say, Darwin wasn't really the person to push the ideas. He was sick, he lived at home, he worked there, his wife was looking after him, he had a large family. But as I say, it wasn't just that. It was, you know, he never had to suffer to push to get what he wanted. It was always given to him. He was never hungry, let's put it that way. Whereas Thomas Henry Huxley came from a middle-class family, but a much lower level middle class. And Thomas Henry Huxley made his way through scholarships and these sort of things. And he became a professor. He was very effective. I like this picture particularly because it shows him in the classroom. He was a brilliant teacher. And he was always, as it were, working, but always pushing. And he took up evolution with great enthusiasm, no question. As far as evolution is concerned, he was very much a proselytizer for evolution. Another person who took up evolution was this man. This is Ernst Haeckel, the German morphologist, embryologist, and certainly controversialist. And he was certainly pushing evolution in Germany from the early 1860s on. And another person who took up these ideas was Herbert Spencer, who was a kind of philosopher, come psychologist, come lots of other things. Ardent progressionist, ardent for progress. So for Spencer, evolution equaled progress equaled evolution all along. But I think there's a subtle change has come now. We're no longer at the level of pseudoscience. I think that what Darwin does in The Origin is he lays out the facts for evolution, one after another. He says, look at embryos, they're so similar. Why would this be? Because of evolution. Look at the homologies, as they're called, between the similarities, the isomorphisms, between the front bones of humans, of horses, of porpoises, of bats, all used for different functions, but the same bones. Why? Because of evolution. Look at the distribution of the tortoises on the Galapagos archipelago. This group of islands off the coast of Ecuador in the Pacific, I think not just off the coast, about 500 miles out. If you go to the Galapagos, you can see the other islands. They're no more than 10 miles, or should I say up here, no more than 15 kilometers apart. So they really are very close, and yet the tortoises on the different islands are different. And Darwin says, how do we explain this? Evolution. They came, they diversified, they went from island to island, rarely, obviously, because tortoises don't swim, so it had to be, they got on a log or a gale or something like that. But they did, and when they got there, they bred and they went apart. So Darwin goes through all of this evidence, also the fossil record. In fact, they didn't, everybody talked about gaps in the fossil record. The most famous missing fossil, other than humans, was Archaeopteryx, the bird reptile. That was discovered in 1863. And of course, as soon as it was discovered, Darwin wrote it into later editions of the Origin. He said, look, I expect to find intermediates between reptiles and birds, and now we found it. In fact, they had Archaeopteryx before the Origin was published, but only feathers, and they didn't realize that it was anything but a fossil bird. It wasn't until they got the whole body that they realized the significance. So, in many respects, though, Darwin's ideas get taken up. There is, in fact, people became evolutionists, even religious people, not the very old, not people of my age, but people of your age. I mean, because, as I pointed out to you, there were lots of facts where Darwin laid out the facts. And it was much easier to say, yes, I accept evolution, special case for humans. But then natural selection, certainly, there's no question, in the scientific world, was not a great success. Partly, I think, a major reason was nobody thought that natural selection could operate today and the effects could be seen, starting with Darwin. I mean, you might say, why didn't Darwin set up selection experiments in his greenhouses? He had these greenhouses, he grew orchids and these sorts of things. Why didn't he do some selection experiments in his greenhouses? I think because Darwin never thought that something like natural selection could work in our lifetime. Now, of course, we know that it can. So, natural selection, it wasn't exactly denied, but it certainly wasn't very popular in the scientific community. And then, of course, in about 1900, people discovered the work that this man, the Moravian monk, Gregor Mendel, had been doing in the 1860s in his monastery garden in Brno. And, of course, what Mendel was offering was a theory of heredity, how characteristics get passed on from one stage to the next. And this was a big problem with, I mean, one of the things you've got to recognize is Darwin's theory wasn't perfect when it was published. And particularly, Darwin didn't have an adequate theory of heredity. And of course, you've got to have an adequate theory of heredity if you've got to have a theory of evolution. People often say, why didn't Darwin and Mendel get together? The answer is, because they weren't really, Mendel wasn't thinking of the work he was doing as a solution for Darwin. In fact, Mendel actually read Darwin's Origin. Darwin didn't read Mendel. He could have done. Books were available, journals were available. But Mendel read the Origin as soon as it was published in German. And we've got the copy, and we've got his, the marginalia, the notes he wrote in the borders. And never ever does Mendel say, Darwin's got a problem with heredity, I think I can solve this. All the time Mendel is saying, can I, a Catholic priest, accept evolution? Which of course makes perfectly good sense. And he argued he could. One lovely possibility is that Darwin and Mendel might have been in the same room at the same time. Mendel went to a big symposium in London in 1861. We know that Darwin used to go to these occasionally when his health allowed. Now, had he done that, Darwin would have been up here, you know, and Mendel would have said, oh, that's Mr. Darwin. I mean, Darwin wouldn't have said that. Where's Mendel in the, you know, like I was trying to find my former student. I mean, Darwin wouldn't, I mean, it didn't make any sense. So you've got to be careful about this. Anyhow, Mendel's ideas are rediscovered around 1900. By this time, people are working on the theory of the cell, and they're almost about the point of chromosomes and the significance of these things. So Mendel starts to make a lot of sense. But as I say, although Mendel makes sense, still evolution is very popular, but the scientific community don't much care for it. Then around about 1930, a number of very gifted mathematicians, Ronald Fisher in England and J.B.S. Haldane and Sewell Wright in America, realized that, in fact, you could take Mendel's theory of, as it was now known as, theory of genetics. I mean, that wasn't Mendel's term, you understand. You could take Mendelian genetics and add to it Darwin's mechanism of natural selection, and you could make a scientific theory out of it. If you like, trendy term, you've got a new paradigm. You've got a fully functioning paradigm. And what is interesting then is, up to this point, there really hadn't been, for instance, in departments of evolution and ecology. In fact, you wouldn't find a professional biologist, if I asked them back in those days, you said, what are you? You would not find a professional biologist saying, I'm an evolutionist. I mean, he would have believed in evolution, but it wouldn't have been what he worked on. He would have been an anatomist or an embryologist or a paleontologist or something like that. Evolution was something which existed in the museums and places like that. It wasn't in the universities. But after 1930, very quickly, now that they've got a new mathematical theory, evolution got professionalized, in the sense that now you started to get people who would have been professional biologists, who would have described themselves as evolutionists, who would have worked in universities rather than in museums, who would have had students, who would have gone out and got grants. And after the Second World War, there were a lot more government grants than there had been before, because the Second World War convinced the victorious powers that science and technology is tremendously important, and we'd better stay abreast of it. And the only way we're going to stay abreast of it is by financing science and technology like hell. And so things like the National Science Foundation were founded precisely at these times, so there was money there. And of course, the other thing that the evolutionists did was they founded a journal. Evolution started in 1948. Now, that doesn't mean to say the popular science of evolution vanished away, because obviously it didn't. And one can draw attention even to this day to the extent to which there's still an awful lot of popular writing about evolution. Or you can buy Nova, for instance, on television, or books by Richard Dawkins, or he's been dead for 10 years now, but particularly Stephen Jay Gould's books, Ever Since Darwin, and all of those sorts of things, give you a popular view of evolution. So the two go on. This is Fisher, the great mathematician who mathematized it. This is Sewell Wright, the American. Sewell Wright worked at the Department of Agriculture for a number of years, and then he worked at the University of Chicago from 1925 to 1955. And then having done 30 years, turning 65, he had to retire. And so he went to work with one of his students in Wisconsin, and I think he worked until he died, when was it? In 1988. So in other words, he worked for 30 years in Chicago at his regular job, and then his retirement job, he worked for 33 years. So it's really quite remarkable. In England, Thomas Henry Huxley's grandson, Julian Huxley, was one of the big promoters of a professional evolution. Julian Huxley is the older brother of Aldous Huxley, the novelist. It's very interesting if you read Aldous Huxley's novels, particularly Brave New World, but After Many a Summer and these books, you can see not only does Aldous Huxley get a lot of science into his books, but it's precisely the science that older brother Julian is actually doing. After Many a Summer is about this rich man who wants to go on and live forever, and it's all about development and that sort of thing. Just the work that Julian had done 10 years before. So you get this very interesting symbiotic relationship. This is Theodosius Dobzhansky, Russian-born, at Columbia University, one of the most influential of professionalizing evolutionary biology in the 20th century. The reason, he's the one in the middle. The reason why I like this picture particularly is that it shows him with his students. And students, of course, are the secret to successful professionalization. This is the way, you see, this is why Huxley was very successful in a way that Darwin wasn't. I mean, Thomas Henry Huxley. Because Thomas Henry Huxley had lots of students. I mean, for instance, when Johns Hopkins was founded in 1876, intending to be a German-style science university, who was the first anatomist there but one of Thomas Henry Huxley's students? In fact, Huxley had a drinking problem, and he ended up in a sanatorium in, of all places, Guelph, Ontario. But so there's a little Canadian connection to my story. Well, yeah, I mean, anybody who's got a founder where you have, you know, plaques all around the country. Sir John A. Macdonald grew up here. Yeah, okay, move on. And this was Dobzhansky's great book that he published in 1937. So I'm giving you an idea of the tempo. So clearly there was a Darwinian revolution, but in certain respects, it's certainly true to say it was kind of delayed. It didn't really, as it were, really catch fire until the 1930s. This is George Gaylord Simpson, the great paleontologist, who published his work, Tempo and Mode in Evolution, published in 1944. Simpson's a very interesting man. He had, in fact, finished it in 1942, but he went to war as an intelligence officer in North Africa. And officially, he was under the control of General George Patton. And Patton, as we all know from the movie, was a real martinet, a real stickler for proper form and uniforms and that sort of thing. Simpson had a beard, and he told Simpson to take it off. And Simpson found some obscure 19th century rule that had never been superseded, which said that people in intelligence were allowed to have beards. And Patton never forgave him for that. Today is probably today's most famous. I mean, today's most famous evolutionist is probably Richard Dawkins. But if you wanted to say, if you asked evolutionists who would be, at least in your top 5 great evolutionists still alive today, I don't think anybody would deny that Edward O. Wilson, the ant specialist and the author of this big book on sociobiology in 1975, would certainly be in the top 5, and my suspicion is he'd be in the top 1 or 2. I mean, everybody would say here we have a really important professional evolutionist. And of course, also as you know, not only have we made great advances in sort of non-human evolution, but today there's been huge advances in our understanding of human evolution. This is Lucy, Australopithecus afarensis, about 3 million years old, discovered in 1972 by Don Johansson and a number of other people in Ethiopia. And what's so fascinating about Lucy is that, as you can see, she walked upright, but she had a chimpanzee-sized brain. She did not have a chimpanzee brain. We've got other skulls of Australopithecus afarensis, and you can look inside and see the indentations and work out what the brain parts were and how big they are. She's got a brain on the way to being like us. She's not a chimp, but she's got a chimpanzee-sized brain, but she walked upright. In fact, she walked upright, but she didn't walk quite as well as we do, and she was clearly much better at climbing trees. So she really is a wonderful missing link. Don Johansson's very proud of this, and I like to say, ah, yes, Don, you made the second great discovery in paleontology. He goes like this, and I say, well, Archaeopteryx, surely. And now, of course, you've discovered something up in the Canadian Arctic, and that, as I say, Don, you're number 3 now. Richard Dawkins, popularizer. I mean, I'm not putting the boot into Dawkins, I'm happy to do so, but I'm certainly not this evening. I mean, clearly, Dawkins is a brilliant science writer. He's brilliant at getting the ideas and putting them together and pulling them together. Blind Watchmaker, for instance, in 1986, a wonderful exposition of evolutionary ideas. And in America, this man who died sadly in 2002, Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist who was at Harvard, and that sort of thing. So as I've said, yes, there was something, but is this all the story? And I'm not convinced. I think there's more to the story, and I'm going to conclude. I'm coming to the end of my talk. But I'm now starting to think that it's a bad mistake just to look at the science like that without looking at the bigger picture. And I think that people like Tennyson give us a clue. Because clearly Tennyson was very important before the origin. Now, I'm not saying so much that Tennyson was important after the origin. He did write some interesting poetry. But what I want to suggest is that if we start to look at the public view, and particularly at the writers, the novelists, the poets, maybe this will give us a better understanding of what went on. So was there a Darwinian revolution? If so, when did it occur? What was its nature? Yes, I'm saying there was a Darwinian revolution. I'm saying so far, let's say 1930, when natural selection picked up, and the big thing was that evolution became kind of professionalized at this point. But I think that's only a partial answer. And in fact, Peter Bowler, a fellow historian of science, who in fact did his degree at the University of Toronto, has actually written a book called The Non-Darwinian Revolution, Reinterpreting a Historical Myth. What Bowler wants to argue is that obviously one doesn't want to deny that Darwin was important. But if you look at the big picture, Darwin's only one part, and not necessarily, the most significant part, or at least he's one amongst many. Because yes, Darwin did come along in 1859, but then you've got people like Huxley and Haeckel. I've been saying how important they were. Then you've got people like Mendel. I've been saying how important they were. Then after that, you get people like Fisher and Sewell Wright. I've been saying how important. And so you go on through Dobzhansky right down to Wilson. So yes, there's a big picture. Clearly, if we're going to call it, there was a revolution, an evolutionary revolution. And obviously, we don't want to say Darwin wasn't important. But whether it really should have been called a Darwinian revolution, the non-Darwinian revolution, reinterpreting a historical myth. And this is the thing, I think that a lot of people think this. I'm inclined to think, though, that if you look at the whole story through literature, you start to get a different picture. You start to realize, even if people didn't always accept Darwin's mechanisms, he just changed the bloody way people thought about the world. After Darwin, it was a different world. People had walked into a different world. I don't say that they were all atheists, because they weren't. I don't even say they were all agnostics. Darwin became an agnostic later in life, never became an atheist. Huxley was a well-known agnostic. Others kept their faith. Ronald Fisher, for instance, was an Anglican. Theodosius Dobzhansky was Russian Orthodox. Sewell Wright was a Unitarian. So some of them kept their faith. So but nevertheless, I think after Darwin, it was a different world. And that if you believed in God, it wasn't the God, the comforting God that you'd grown up with. It was a different sort of... And of course, I think what's very interesting today is you find a lot of Christians today trying to come to terms with this. For instance, thinking about the problem of evil, not in terms of, you know, free will, but in terms of the book of Job, which calls for a different kind of understanding. It's a different world we've moved into. And I think it's Darwin who did it. But let's look at some of the figures. I'm only going to give you just a very brief run through now. But let's look at Thomas Hardy, one of the really, truly great novelists of the 19th century. Great poet too. I mean, something you don't often find going together. Not exactly a cheery writer. Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which I think is his greatest novel, has the heroine hanged in the penultimate paragraph of the book. And then the hero goes off with Tess's sister. And what Hardy doesn't mention is that in Victorian England, they would not have been allowed to marry, because a man could not marry his deceased wife's sister. So, not a cheery writer. But Hardy is in a different world. And he's picking up on evolutionary ideas. One of his early novels, A Pair of Blue Eyes, is fascinating. You know the story that when you're drowning, the whole of your life is supposed to appear before you. You know, when you're at the point of death, suddenly the whole... And he has this conceit. He has this man who slips, and he falls halfway down a cliff, and he's kind of, you know, like just hanging on, just like that. Just like a cartoon, Hagar the Horrible or something like that. He's holding on to something sticking out. And he sees a trilobite in the cliff. It's in the south of England. And so the story goes, time closed up like a fan before him. He saw himself at one extremity of the years, face to face with the beginning and the intermediate centuries simultaneously. And so what Hardy does is, instead of talking about this man flipping through his own life, he talks about this man flipping through the history of all life. So in other words, he takes the idea that, you know, we see everything, our lives in a flash like that. And what he does is he puts it into Darwinian terms, and we see it in terms of fossils. So, fierce men clothed in the hides of beasts, carrying for defense and attack huge clubs and pointed spears, rose from the rock like the phantoms before the doomed Macbeth. They lived in hollows, woods and huts. Perhaps behind them stood an earlier band. No man was there. Huge elephantine forms, the mastodon, the hippopotamus, the tapir, and so monstrous sides, all for the moment in juxtaposition. All of these followed through his eye. Was he, and he was again considering the actual present, was he to die? So what I'm trying to say to you is, this is published in 1876. It's one of Hardy's early novels. Almost immediately, Darwin's ideas get taken up, and it's Darwin that they're reading, get taken up, and as it were, become part of the fabric of culture in some sort of sense. So that people would have known about this. And as I say, I can't keep emphasizing enough. No television, no films. So where did people get it? Oh, theatre perhaps if you lived in a big city, but mainly through they call them three-decker novels, because the novels were always published in 3 volumes, and the lending libraries like Mudie's would send them to you, and you'd have a week or 2 weeks to read them, and then you'd turn it back and then you get the next one. And they were reading Trollope and Dickens and George Eliot and later Hardy and all of these things. So what I'm saying is, it's Darwin gets into the fabric of things. Later on, of course, in America, Jack London, The Call of the Wild. I love this book. I love this book. Do you know that this book, which was published, I think, in 1906, if you go to Amazon.com, there are over 30 editions of this book in print today. Over 30 editions of this book. It's terrible stuff, but you know, some of these people, like Jack London and the Edgar Rice Burroughs, who wrote Tarzan, and Bram Stoker, who wrote Dracula, if you read these books, you come away and you say, you know, it is pulp fiction, but by God, these people had a narrative power that you can see why they've persisted. Oh yeah, it's popular stuff. But I mean, again, it's like television, isn't it? I mean, some television programs, okay, it's just telly, but they kind of catch your imagination. And you know, I remember when The Sopranos started, for instance. It just had something about it that caught you. You know, it was total BS. You know, a mafia don who has to go into psychoanalysis and that sort of thing. Give me a break. But it had something, and these books also have something. But so this is the big fight. If you know Call of the Wild, Buck is taken from a soft life, a dog, in California and shipped up to the Yukon, where he has to make his way. Buck possessed a quality that made for greatness. But greatness, imagination. He fought by instinct. He could fight by head as well. He rushed as though attempting the old shoulder trick. I don't know what that is. But the last instant swept low. His teeth closed on Spitzer's left foreleg. There was a crunch of breaking bone, and the white dog faced him on 3 legs. Thrice he tried to knock him down. Spitz struggled madly to keep up. I love this last line. There was no hope for him. Buck was inexorable. Mercy was a thing reserved for gentler climes. I mean, I'm coming up here. You know, mercy is reserved for Florida, not for Sudbury, if you know what I mean. But it's part of the kind of fabric of the way that people are thinking. Now, what about sexual selection? Everybody got on sexual selection. They loved sexual selection. I really like this book. This is by a man called George Gissing. It's called New Grub Street. Again, you read these books. They're not necessarily great books, but they're not, you know, canon like Middlemarch. You know, they're not, you know, like Middlemarch or something. You know, the books that you really should read, Tessa the D'Urbervilles, you know, and something by D.H. Lawrence. But they have a real narrative power, and he's dealing with sexual selection. Yes. So he's talking about the heroine. He was so human. He said the heroine has her eyes on one of the chaps, and he's not the best chap. He's the guy who more inclined to write advertising copy than sonnets. There are 2 of them. There's the one guy who writes sonnets, the other one writes advertising copy. But the one who writes advertising copy has a certain umph about him that the other one doesn't have. He was so human that a youth of all but monastic seclusion had prepared him to love the man who aimed with frank energy at the joys of life. A taint of pedantry would have repelled her. She did not ask for high intellect or great attainments, but vivacity, courage, determination to succeed were delightful to her senses. And so, taking up, no, you say, well, yeah, but anybody might have done. Oh no, Gissing wants to make you very clear that where he's getting it from. So later in the book he says, though she had never opened one of Darwin's books, her knowledge of his main theories and illustrations was respectable. In other words, Gissing is giving us the clues. That's where he's getting it from. So what I'm saying is these things get, as it were, into the culture. Dr. Jekyll, or supposedly pronounced Dr. Jekyll, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. It's a novella in 1886, and then it's made, one of the first, it's been made into a movie several times, but I think the best one is the 1931 movie with Frederick March, which was made just before the purity code came into account, and they had to take 6 minutes out when it did come in, but now you can buy the extended version. It's really pretty risque. Now, as I'm sure you know, the story is of Dr. Jekyll, who is a respectable doctor, but, you know, has eyes elsewhere, and so he takes this potion which turns him into Mr. Hyde, and then he goes out and robs and whatever. It's very interesting. The novel, or the novella, it's not a full novel, by Robert Louis Stevenson, the man who wrote Treasure Island, is mainly about Calvinistic Presbyterian original sin. If you read the novel, it's clear that what he's got in mind is the theological issue of original sin. And that or even a good man like Dr. Jekyll has within him Mr. Hyde, and we all do. By the time the movie's made in 1931, First of all, Dr. Jekyll has a girlfriend, which doesn't come into the novella. Secondly, the girlfriend has a father, which doesn't come into the novella. Thirdly, Dr. Jekyll wants to marry the girlfriend, but the father won't let them, which doesn't come in. In other words, it's been converted into a Freudian allegory. It's a really good movie, I'm not complaining, but it's all about Freud. No Freud back here. It's original sin combined with ideas of degeneration. Because, of course, Darwin allowed not only could you progress up, but if things go wrong, things might degenerate. And by the end of the 19th century, with the arms race between England and Germany over ships, and with so many slums and depressions, people are starting to think much more in terms of degeneration. And what is fascinating in the novel is that Mr. Hyde is presented as a degenerate. In other words, he's presented as something lower down the evolutionary scale, as something ape-like. There comes an end to all things. The most capacious measure is filled at last. Brief condescension to evil finally destroyed the balance of my soul. I looked down. This is Dr. Jekyll writing a sort of suicide note. My clothes hung formlessly on my shrunken limbs. The hand that laid on my knee was corded and hairy. I was once more Edward Hyde. Hence the ape-like tricks that he would play me, scrawling in my own hand blasphemies on the pages of my books, burning the letters and destroying the portrait of my father. Indeed, had it not been for his fear of death, he would long ago have ruined himself in order to involve me in the ruin. In other words, Mr. Hyde is presented as ape-like, degenerate, lower down. So it's in the fabric of people's thinking. Now, I come to an end. It's still going on, folks. It's still going on. If you read Ian McEwan, the English novelist, who has written several novels, about 10 or more, who is well known as a good friend of Richard Dawkins, and if you look at his novels, for instance, one of his better known ones, Saturday. Saturday is all about a surgeon who is, on a Saturday, a brain surgeon, who is captured, or the family is captured by this man who is kind of crazy. He's got Huntington's career. And the surgeon knocks him down the stairs and then has to go into hospital to do brain surgery on him. It really is melodramatic. But it's fascinating how all the time what Ian McClellan is doing is saying laws, Darwinian laws are things that count. Forget religion and that sort of thing. And in fact, the hero at the beginning of the book is reading a biography of Darwin, just so we know that what's going on. So what I'm saying is you still get these things in the kind of fabric of literature. Not in all literature, obviously. The Darwinian revolution at one level is over, although I think there's been something of a renaissance recently with the new atheists and that sort of thing. Well, so my final thing is, yes, there was a Darwinian revolution. Yes, it's a lot more complex than you might think. Yes, it's true that it didn't become properly professionalized as science until about 1930. But no, it would be a terrible travesty to talk about non-Darwinian revolutions, because Darwin truly did alter the way that people thought about the world. And if you look at as I say, at the creative writers of the day for the 50, 60, 70 years afterwards, you see it again and again and again. It's a different world, folks, and that's the one that we live in today.
Did you want to field questions from the audience yourself, or would you like to?
Okay.
By all means, please direct your questions to Maybe I'll start off, if you don't mind, because I can. So you speak of the Darwinian ideas emerging in the context of...
Just a second.
Oh.
It's echoing. What'd you say?
Oh, so you speak of the Darwinian ideas emerging in the context of literature. What about other arts? Do they emerge in the context of visual arts or theater or musical?
That's a good question. One of the places where you do look is in cartoons. And people have in fact looked at cartoons. And they're very, very revealing about how people are thinking about these things. To give you just one example, you've got to remember that the Irish in Victorian Britain were a major phenomenon on the land. Not only was England, Great Britain and Ireland all one country still, but there were 10 million Great Britons and 5 million Irish. In other words, today there are 60 million Great Britons and still 5 million Irish. So the Irish were a big phenomenon. Of course, they were coming over, particularly after the terrible famines in the 1840s, and they were also being used by the Brits not only as servants but also as navigators, because this was the time when they were building a lot of railways. And to build railways, you needed, particularly in those days, because you didn't have mechanical things to do it with, you needed a lot of brawn. And so you get a lot of Irish who, of course, would be a gang, get paid on a Saturday, and, you know, paint the town red and whatever. So the people were very tense about the Irish. As soon as The Origin of Species is published, the cartoons of the Irish portray them as being ape-like. As soon as The Origin is published, you get Paddy and Mick and these, and Punch talks about Mr. G. O'Rilla, for instance. And so here's a case in point where you can pick up those sorts of things and that sort of use. So that's one area, certainly, where you would certainly get interesting Darwinian resonances. I think yes. Yeah.
Because of reason you make your presentation, very much but because of accent and other factors, you know that only James
Burke.
I mean, the James Burke connections came to North America as just the way you present this story reminds me of the way he presents the story of human progress in the last 100 years. And I thought you might know who he was. Okay, well, I'll look him up. Yeah, right. No, well, I mean, this is it. You do find all sorts of interesting resonances like that. And you've got to remember that particularly by about 1850, North America is really coming very much more into the discourse, if you like. And then, of course, there's the Civil War. But after the Civil War, particularly in the North, as I mentioned, for instance, the founding of Johns Hopkins University, which was a deliberate effort to upgrade American science. And as I say, people like Huxley were involved in this, and so it becomes much more one discourse. I mean, the interesting question is, why the South? And of course, a lot of this is to do with the loss in the Civil War, and as it were, putting up the barriers. I mean, people pointed this out. An awful lot of the development of American fundamentalism is done less for theological reasons and more as a kind of barrier against the North. And but we see it at the moment in Alabama over the gay marriage. Well, we do. I mean, the Supreme Court, has said you've got to allow gay marriage, and the Chief Justice is saying no. So you see what. Now, at one level, it's a religious argument. At one level, it's a religious argument. Should a couple of gay people be allowed to marry? The Bible says no. But at another level, it's clearly states' rights. It's basically up yours, to the Northerners. And Ed Larson has written about the Scopes Monkey trial. And the Scopes Monkey trial is fascinating in that respect. It was the encroachment of Northern ideas, upsetting Southern ways and all of these things. The kids were coming home and talking about these things. And parents were saying, what the hell is going on? And so, to understand these things, you've got to look at them culturally as well as theologically. I don't mean there's no theology, of course there is. But, and as I say, one of the interesting things of a person who has written very strongly against Dawkins is Marilyn Robinson,
who's a Christian novelist, I think a very good one. And if you read her, she is wrestling with the same problems on the other side. As I mentioned in the book of Job, and she's wrestling with the problem of evil and saying, how can we reconcile ourselves to evil in a Darwinian world? And what Christ does, as I say, a lot of them are saying, stop trying to explain it. You know, God says, my ways are not your ways, you know, accept it. And so you get the, I'm not saying that works, but as I say, you get these fascinating discussions through literature.
Michael, could you repeat the question after it's been spoken? Sound is transmitting so very well. If you could repeat the question after you've been...
Oh, okay, yes. Well, I didn't answer his question anyway, so there's no point in repeating that. Yes, man here.
Why are we still talking about a Darwinian revolution? I mean, much of evolutionary thought has moved on past that, but we're still fascinated by Darwin and his impact on our culture. Why hasn't it been replaced by a Mendelian revolution? And there must be something beyond his science, which is interesting, but we've moved past. So
why are we still talking about a Darwinian revolution rather than, say, a Mendelian revolution or whatever? Well, of course, at one level, some of us are still talking about Mendelian revolutions, but surely the answer is human beings. That the answer is Darwin strikes right at the question of the status of us. Now, Darwin in the Origin has, I said he didn't talk about it. That's not quite true. He has one paragraph in the Origin which says light will be thrown on man and his history. We know that Darwin, right from the beginning, thought that humans were part of the evolutionary story. But in the Origin, he wanted to get his ideas out on paper before everybody started to talk about humans, which, of course, as Huxley shows, that's precisely what happened. So my suspicion is that the reason why we're talking about Darwin is because it's about humans. But as I was saying in my response to the man over there, in a way, often this is a flag for, if you like, a deeper, I don't know, deeper, is that the right word? A broader issue, sort of modernity versus tradition or something like that. Up to the, if you like, even up to the Enlightenment, it was a tight little world, and we had our place in this world. And the parish priest, and you know, it was frightening, it was scary, but people had their place. They knew where they were. They knew what the future was going to be. You know, if you were Catholics, it was going to be purgatory and that sort of thing. You knew what you've got to do, and all of these things. And your life made sense. And then it all starts to come apart, and suddenly it's not working. And I think, if you like, I think Darwin, in a sense, is a flag, almost, if you like. He epitomizes what's going on. I would certainly say Darwin's part cause, part effect. I think Darwin himself is tremendously important. I don't think it's, you know, everybody's equal in this one. I don't think they are. But, so I think Darwin is tremendously important, a key figure in this. But I think the reason why we're talking about it is because it's not just Darwin, it's gay marriage in Alabama and those sorts of things. And this is tremendously a fight, you know, about human nature. Because it's intensified in America, I think. I've lived there now for 15 years. I think it's intensified in America because America is not as secure as it felt in the 50s. I know the Cold War was going on, but America had won. And America was rich. And America had material possessions and cars with silly fins on them and drive-ins and that sort of thing. Although the Russians were terribly threatening, everybody knew they weren't up to us, sort of thing. And I think now there's an awful lot, and I think this is, you know, this dysfunctional Congress we've got, is places like China are coming up, places like India are coming up. The whole threat of what's going on with Muslim extremists, even Putin, and you know, and so I think America feels much more under threat. And of course, when you feel under threat, there's a temptation, as it were, to put your head in the sand and to go back to common sense. Well, we saw it, didn't we, in Ontario with Mike Harris. I mean, can you imagine anything more bloody stupid than putting Mike Harris in charge of the economy for 5 years? But he got in power because people were tense and they didn't know quite what to do. He came through with a simple message, and it was simple, simplistic, but I mean, so that's how I would answer your question. Yes?
Perhaps this is a rhetorical question, but perhaps you could give me your view on it. Why is it Lamarck put in the same category as Darwin?
Why is he or isn't he?
Yeah, isn't he?
Oh, well, he didn't get it right for starters. Darwin, if you read The Origin, Darwin does lay out, I mean, he really does lay out the case for evolution in a very sophisticated way. Now, Lamarck, if you read Lamarck's Philosophie zoologique of 1809, what Lamarck is doing is pulling in a bit from here and a bit from there, and then he starts talking about progress and all these things. You see, Lamarck's an interesting man. He's an aristocrat, and yet during the French Revolution, not only did he not get his head chopped off, he throve. He did well. Why? Because he was an avant-garde philosophe, progressivist thinker. And if you read the book, it's that. I wouldn't take anything from Lamarck. I mean, whenever I go to Paris and I go to the Jardin du Plan, there's a statue of Lamarck at the just down by the Seine, and I always go and pay homage to him. Behind it, it says, "Posterity will remember you, my father." His daughter wrote that. And yeah, they did. But if you go in the museum that they've got, the Gallery of Natural History, which is evolution, who is their hero there? It's Chuck Darwin. It really truly is Darwin. Because at some level, Darwin got it right. But as I say, and as I was saying in my response to this man, it's also, I think, Darwin is a kind of flag for a lot more. And that sort of thing happens. That, you know, a hell of a lot of people, my neighbours haven't read Darwin. They don't know a bloody thing, but they know it's wrong. Yes?
So you talk about the influence of Darwin's writings on culture, and I'm interested in the connection or the influence on capitalism and social.
Darwin and capitalism, and that's a very complex question. And you know, the easiest thing is to say part cause and part effect, and I think that it's true. Certainly, I think, I mean, obviously at one level, Darwin comes in having picked up ideas about Malthusian ideas about struggle for existence. And Darwin, as I pointed out, is a very rich man, so Darwin himself was very much in favor of capitalism. I mean, you see what Darwin said about the unions. He sounds like a Republican governor in the Midwest at the moment. I mean, Scott Walker's got nothing on Charles Darwin when it comes to talking about unions. So there's all of that. After that, you do get some very rich businessmen like Andrew Carnegie who pick up on Darwinian or Spencerian ideas, although always these things get molded. I mean, when I grew up as a little boy in Warsaw Staffs, we had a Carnegie library. And I got to Guelph just when they knocked down their Carnegie library. Now, why did Carnegie, who was a very, very rich man, why did he found public libraries rather than, say, put it into hospitals? Because this would be a place where the poor but bright child could go and thereby better themselves. In other words, he wasn't interested in the elimination of the weak, you know, nature red in tooth and claw, like Tennyson was talking about. He was much more interested in the survival of the fittest. Those who are good should be given the opportunity to survive, and so you get some all sorts of readings like that. Now, you know, people pick up on ideas and they use them to, what shall I say, to give credibility to some things they believe already. So if you look at von Bernhardi, the German general just before the First World War, who says that war is a good thing, that nations need to spill blood, you know, it's a cleansing thing. You know, and he's quite happy to quote Darwin. It's not in Darwin at all, but people, you know, use it. I mean, even Hitler. I mean, Hitler's, you know, did Darwin lead to Hitler? Well, you can pull out isolated passages, but then you read the whole passage, and Hitler's going on and on and on about Jews and living space. Yeah, there ain't anything in Darwin about those sorts of things. So this is, you know, this is the thing. It goes back to my talking about it's a kind of flag, and people use these sort of terminology. Don't forget the term social Darwinism, for instance, that gets bandied around, is a 1940s term. It was Hofstadter introduced it. Back then, I think that it had been used, but nobody thought of themselves as a social Darwinian or something like that. It just wasn't language that people used. Yes?
I think something you really elegantly put together, it's the context of what those things happen in that period, and all the other people that were involved somehow, and the poets and the writers. And we had a workshop a couple of weeks ago organized by another philosopher, Brett Buchanan, about the legacy of John Muir. And
oh yes,
will there be another, what's his legacy? And I think here one of the discussions is what's the Darwin's legacy? And one of the questions that we did not answer is, will there be another John Muir? And I think the question I have is...
You're talking about John Muir, the naturalist who founded the Sierra Club.
Yeah. Will there be another revolution?
That's a very, very interesting question. The man's asking me about John Muir, the Scot who went to America and was a big you know, ecologist in the general sense, way before, you know, anybody knew about these things, and was the founder of Sierra Club. And what about people like John Muir? Actually, I've written about this because I've been very interested in the Gaia hypothesis. And what is fascinating is I think that although people like John Muir would say, oh yes, I'm a Darwinian, again, if you look at what they're writing stuff that Darwin, I mean, yes, at one level, he does feel that. But at another level, John Muir says, I never saw blood in nature, or nature is much more holistic, it's much more working together in harmony, and of course then you always get the kicker, but of course when humans came along and messed it all up. Everybody loved each other until humans came along, where all of nature what pleases and only man is vile. I think that's Keats or somebody like that, much earlier. But, so Muir, I would say, Muir belongs in a tradition, he may use the word Darwin, but I would take Muir back much more to the Romantics, to people like Wordsworth, and of course in America, the American Transcendentalists, who were much more inclined to talk in terms of world souls. You know, that's what, I mean, that's the sort of language that Emerson uses. And of course, Thoreau is tremendously important. You see, when I grew up in England, we all read, or if we didn't read, we had told to us Pilgrim's Progress. It was impossible for a 10-year-old in 1950 in Britain not to know the basics of Pilgrim's Progress, Christian at the Cross, and that sort of thing. I mean, that, in America, it's impossible for a kid to grow up without knowing something about Thoreau. It's part of American culture. I mean, I've got no objection to it. I mean, I'm not complaining about it. But my feeling is that when you look at people like Thoreau, like John Muir, like Aldo Leopold, for instance, and certainly like Rachel Carson, if you read Rachel Carson, who incidentally is a very skilled science writer, I mean, she's very, very skilled. So, you know, I'm not taking anything from her. But she says, I went to bed with Thoreau by my bedside every night. And I've got no reason to doubt her on that. That this is the kind of holistic thinking. Now, I personally, you know, there's a lot of debate amongst Darwin scholars on this. I personally think Darwin has a harsher vision of the world. Darwin, I think, sees a bloodier world, a world of competition. A world where businesses fail and where organisms fail. I personally think that Darwin has a different sort. I mean, he's not a selfish gene man because he doesn't know about genes. I see Darwin as that. But I think what's fascinating is I see so often you get this balance in biologists. One, for a while in the 1970s, it looked as though the selfish genus were going to win on naked arm wrestling, naked mud wrestling. But then, there's others come in with more holistic views. Not necessarily that they're going to work, but you do get this. And so you get this sort of it's almost like paradigms, but Kuhn talks about paradigms. Here's one, here's another, here's another. It's much more I see them going on, and a lot of it, the scientists here won't like my saying this, I think a lot of it is, I won't say religious commitment, but emotional commitment. That's the kind of world you like. That's the kind of way you want the world to be. Now, how are we doing, Gillian? Okay, I've got a couple more questions. I'm more than happy to keep going. I'm happy to take more questions from young women. More than happy to do that, but I'll speak to the bald bloke over here first. Hello.
Hello. Pleased to meet you. My question is somewhat off topic. So you've been teaching in the States.
This question's off topic. I've got to tell everybody what you do. Yeah.
So you've been teaching in the States, and I was just wondering, one, if you've had the experience of having intelligent designers in your classroom say things, and if you've had, how you handle those questions.
How do I handle intelligent designers? Well, I feel more comfortable about handling intelligent designers. In fact, I've co-edited a book with one of them because I'm a philosopher. And I think it's legitimate for me to talk about intelligent design. If I were a scientist, I'd feel much more uncomfortable about this, because I'd be inclined to say, I don't think it's genuine science, and we're trying to do a science in the classroom. I don't mean that we wouldn't talk about it. I don't mean I wouldn't say, let's go and have a cup of coffee, afterwards, or something like that. And because I would hope a teacher would do that sort of thing. But basically, I think intelligent design is wrong. So I think you've got to start there. But the second thing is, saying that it's wrong is not going to win anything. You've got to try to talk about these things and try to show that there may be other ways of looking at it. And they're pointing out that not all intelligent designers believe exactly the same things. And I think it's also worthwhile asking why people feel the need for this sort of thing. I understand when Dawkins says bringing your child up as a Catholic is a form of child abuse. I know what he means, but it's not terribly helpful in the classrooms that I teach. It really isn't. Now, am I a phony, slimy hypocrite if I don't say that? Well, I'm prepared to show the Magdalen sisters in my philosophy and film course. But no, the answer is you can't get at it that sort of way. You have to do, for instance, I'll give you an example of what I think was my best teaching opportunity ever. It was the week after 9/11, and I was teaching Hume. And basically I came in, I said, we'll get to Hume. And we did by the end of the class. But I said, let's talk about 9/11 and this. And of course they were all into Paracelsus and that sort of thing. And I was immediately able to say, but you know that the church doesn't like astrology and these things because it implies a form of determinism. We had a fantastic discussion. And I personally feel that I'm happy to talk about intelligent design because, as I say, I'm a philosophy prof, not a science prof. And I can do this. I can't do it, non-stop. But I can do this, and I'm happy to do this, and I do. But as I say, I think you've got to make it very clear where you stand. But I think at the same time, if you're a teacher, it's not terribly helpful just to tell students that what they think is just a load of pernicious bullshit. I mean, it doesn't help moving forward. I think you do much better, for instance. I wrestle with these things, for instance, about atheism and this sort of thing. And I could tell the students why, when I was 21 and I gave up God, I thought I'd come back to God when I was 70 to cover my options, and why I don't feel the need to now. I can talk about accomplishments and things like that. And that's, I think, is how you try to do it. You pick up on these daft ideas. Now, you're not going to convince, you know, you're not going to get conversions. I'm not Billy Graham, you know, I'm not Billy Graham. But you try to drip, drip, drip a little water all the time. And, you know, I think it works. I mean, gay marriage, Florida passed a law, you know, a constitutional amendment against it in 2007. But we've got gay marriage now, and people are not going around with banners like that. There are a couple of letters to the paper. But if you'd been in downtown Tallahassee the day that they were allowed to do it, I mean, it was a wonderful occasion. So you can make progress, but it's not always easy. Yes, young man.
I know that the organon, my voice is very poor, I have a cold, but I know that the organon...
Excuses.
I'm wondering how much you made... Darwin was influenced by Aristotle in his thinking, especially in the writing of the organon. And the reason I ask is because Aristotle really developed ideas of homology, even in his biological examinations. And the evidence of homology...
Good question. The extent to which Darwin was influenced by Aristotle. There is a letter written late in life where Darwin says something like, good old Aristotle, what good thoughts he had. But general opinion is that Aristotle as such didn't have a lot of influence on the younger Darwin. Now, we know that, you see, Darwin would have had a classical education, so he'd certainly known about Aristotle. But even to this day, the person that the English read is Plato rather than Aristotle. When I was at boarding school, we did Plato's Republic. We didn't do the Nicomachean Ethics. And Darwin knew a lot more Plato than he knew Aristotle. Now, having said that, Darwin, as I say, was an educated Englishman at a time when educated Englishmen were educated Englishmen. And so, yes, it would have been, he would have had an understanding. Similarly, how much did Darwin know about Kant, for instance, and the third critique, where Kant talks about a lot of these issues? Probably Darwin never read Kant, but he mixed with people who were philosophers like William Whewell, who would have told him. So it's rather like that heroine. She'd never read Darwin, but she knew and I think it's pretty clear that Darwin had a good working knowledge of a lot of these things. But as I say, the one philosopher Locke, he'd certainly read Locke. I can't find much that he must have known about Descartes, but I can't find much that he knew about Descartes. He certainly read Locke. He certainly read some Plato. And he read not all of David Hume by any means, but we do know that he read quite a bit of David Hume, for instance, his essay on religion, for instance, and on one or two things like that. And he certainly, I think, had read probably the Inquiry. He certainly didn't read the treatise. So we know that he'd read some of that material. Later on in life, we know he read Kant's Metaphysics of Morals, because he discusses that in the Descent. But overall, of course, you've got to remember that Darwin was not a philosopher. He was a scientist, and that's how he thought of himself. But as I say, in that day and age, one would have, an educated Englishman would have much more comfortably have moved into those things. I mean, I'm trying not to show off too much, but I'm very much aware that the kind of education I have leads me much more comfortably to move to a lot of those sorts of things, because that's, you know, isn't necessarily the best education. I mean, if it came to modern languages, my God. But I mean, that was the kind of way that education was structured. And you see it again and again in Darwin's thinking. Yes, young woman?
I'm just wondering about, you were talking about, going back to the culture, because I find that very fascinating about the of the science, and we were talking about between like the first phase, which you were talking about the pseudoscience.
Yes.
I was wondering if you have noticed or if you related any writings or poetry throughout that time that was permeating throughout the culture.
What other writings? Well, of course, I talked about Tennyson. You can go back earlier, and you can look at Browning, for instance, picks up on some evolutionary ideas in the 1830s. And then you've got Disraeli, who became the Prime Minister, who was he has some funny things to say in one of his novels, Tancred, about vestiges. But you could go back. And what's interesting is, this is a very interesting question. The woman asked me again about the relationship of literature and this sort of thing. It depends how you're looking at it. For instance, I'll give you one example. One of the earliest evolutionists was Diderot. I mentioned him in the context of Progress, the French philosophe, encyclopedist. And we know that Diderot believed very strongly in evolution. He believed in progress. And Diderot wrote a novel, The Nun. And it's all about a girl who gets into a nunnery, and it's all about Mother Superior, bringing herself. It's really, quite erotic, but it's really very dirty. I mean, 50 Shades of Grey have got nothing on Diderot, on nuns, and that sort of. Now, why is he writing a novel about lesbian nuns? And I want to say, obviously, what he's doing, that's knocking religion while he's promoting, evolutionary ideas on the other. I mean, I always say, how is it that the world's best-known evolutionist, not the world's best evolutionist, world's best-known evolutionist, Richard Dawkins, is also the world's best-known atheist? And I don't think that that's, just chance. I think you look for connections, and again, I think you find them.
Okay, well, let's thank our guest speaker.